Last episode, we watched Shah Abbas the Great turn a broken empire into something the world genuinely stopped to stare at. Isfahan, the silk trade, a professional army, a diplomatic network stretching to Elizabeth I's court. And then his successors locked themselves in the palace, fired every competent person they knew, and waited for disaster. They didn't have to wait long. Welcome to the 1700s. The most violent, chaotic, dramatic century in Iranian history. Empires will fall. Conquerors will rise. A commoner will steal a throne, invade India, and bring home the most famous diamond in the world. And then lose his mind entirely. As the 1700s dawned, the once mighty Safavid Empire was a hollow shell of its former self. And sitting on the throne was Shah Sultan Hussein, quite possibly the least equipped ruler for the moment history had ever produced. Sultan Hussein was not evil. He was not cruel. He was deeply, sincerely pious, and completely detached from the reality of governing an empire under pressure from every direction. In the east, the Hotaki Afghans, a Pashtun tribal confederation that the Safavids had been mismanaging for decades, had finally had enough. Under their leader, Mahmud Hotaki, they organized, they marched, and in 1722, they arrived at the gates of Isfahan. What followed was a siege that lasted 7 agonizing months. No dramatic last stand, no heroic defense, just starvation, disease, and a court so paralyzed by indecision that they couldn't organize a coherent resistance. In October 1722, Shah Sultan Hussein walked out of the gates of Isfahan, removed his own turban, and placed it on Mahmud Hotaki's head. He surrendered his crown personally to a tribal rebel. 221 years of Safavid rule over. The Afghan occupation was brutal. Massacres, looting, the systematic destruction of the administrative networks Abbas had spent decades building. The city that was half the world was now an occupied ruin. Here is where it gets worse, because the moment the Safavid Empire visibly collapsed, everyone who had been circling patiently decided it was time to land. The Ottomans immediately seized western Iran and the Caucasus. Peter the Great of Russia, who had been watching the Safavid collapse with barely concealed excitement, launched his Caspian campaign and grabbed the northern provinces. The Afghans held the center, and what was left of legitimate Iranian authority fragmented into competing warlords. For roughly 7 years, Iran as a unified state simply did not exist. It was a geographic expression, a memory, a name on a map that no longer corresponded to any single political reality. And now, finally, we meet the man this century was waiting for, Nader. Born around 1688 in the Khorasan region to a humble family. His father made felt. He was, by any conventional measure, nobody. He was enslaved as a young man after a tribal raid. He escaped. He joined various military factions, rose through pure competence and terrifying force of will, and by his 30s had become the most effective military commander in a country that desperately needed one. Nader aligned himself with a surviving Safavid prince, Shah Tahmasp II, not out of loyalty, but out of strategy. He needed a legitimate flag to march under while he did the real work of reconquering Iran. Between 1729 and 1735, Nader achieved what should have been impossible. He expelled the Afghans from central Iran. He pushed the Ottomans back out of the western territories. He negotiated the Russians out of the northern provinces. He reunified the country in 6 years. In 1736, Nader had had enough of pretending. He called a grand assembly, declared the Safavid line finished, and crowned himself Shah of Iran. The felt maker's son was now the king of kings. Now, here is where Nader Shah goes from impressive to genuinely jaw-dropping, because after reunifying Iran, he decided, for reasons that were partly strategic and partly because he was Nader Shah, to invade the Mughal Empire. His official justification was that the Mughals were harboring Afghan rebels. His actual motivation was simpler. The Mughal Empire was fabulously, almost incomprehensibly wealthy, and Nader needed to fund his military machine. In 1739, Nader's army crossed into India. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Karnal, and it was over almost before it began. Nader's artillery destroyed the Mughal formations before they could effectively engage. His cavalry flanked, his infantry advanced. The Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah was captured personally. 3 hours. That was all it took. Nader entered Delhi, and then came the Delhi Massacre, a tragic, catastrophic event where a misunderstanding spiraled into Nader ordering his troops into the city, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. It remains one of the darkest moments of his campaign. From the ruins of his victory, Nader took what he came for: the contents of the Mughal treasury, so vast it allegedly allowed him to suspend taxation in Iran for 3 years. The Peacock Throne itself, which he brought back to Iran, and a small stone that would become the most famous jewel in history. Nader Shah returned from India at the absolute peak of his power. He controlled an empire stretching from the Caucasus to the Indus. He was unchallenged, undefeated, and he was beginning to unravel. The campaigns never stopped. The taxation to fund them became crushing. Revolts broke out across the empire, and Nader, who had always been ruthless, became paranoid, viciously, dangerously paranoid. When a revolt broke out in Khorasan and he suspected his own son Reza Kohli of being involved, a suspicion that was almost certainly false, Nader had him blinded. His own son, his intended heir. By the accounts of people who knew him, Nader was never the same after that moment. The guilt consumed him. The paranoia deepened. The violence against his own subjects escalated. The brilliant general was disappearing, replaced by something frightening. In 1747, his own officers, afraid for their lives, assassinated him in his tent while he slept. The Napoleon of Persia died not in battle, but at the hands of the men he commanded. After Nader's assassination, Iran collapsed into civil war again. A dozen warlords fought over the pieces of his empire. And from this chaos, one figure emerged who was genuinely, fascinatingly different from every ruler we've discussed so far. Karim Khan was a Lur tribesman from western Iran. He was tough, capable, and militarily gifted. He had to be to survive the post-Nader chaos. But what made him extraordinary was what he refused to do. Karim Khan refused the title of Shah entirely. He called himself Vakil ol-Roaya, the advocate of the people. In a century drowning in megalomaniacs and conquerors, he chose to present himself as a servant of his subjects. It wasn't just a title, it was a governing philosophy. He moved his capital to Shiraz, the city of poets and gardens, and what followed was one of the most peaceful, culturally rich periods in 18th century Iranian history. Art flourished, trade recovered, taxes were reasonable, justice was, remarkably, actually administered. He reportedly said that he had no desire for conquest, only for the welfare of his people. Whether or not he said it exactly that way, his actions matched the sentiment. He was in a century of extraordinary violence and extraordinary anomaly. He died in 1779, peacefully, which was genuinely remarkable for an 18th century Iranian ruler. And the moment he died, the Zand dynasty began to collapse almost immediately, torn apart by succession wars. From the Zand succession wars, one faction emerged victorious, a Turkic tribal confederation from northern Iran called the Qajars, led by the ferocious Aga Muhammad Khan, who would bring the century to a close and open a new, complicated chapter in Iranian history. So what did the 1700s give Iran? Honestly, mostly scars. The Fall of Isfahan, the Afghan occupation, Russian and Ottoman land grabs, the brilliant madness of Nader Shah, more civil wars than any century deserves. But the century also showed something important about Iran, The same thing the 1500s showed, that even in total collapse, the identity holds. The language, the culture, the sense of being distinctly, irreducibly Iranian. It survives everything, even itself. Next episode, the 1800s. The Qajars are in charge, and they are about to face something neither Nader's sword nor Karim Khan's wisdom could have prepared Iran for. Two of the most powerful empires in history, the British Empire and the Russian Empire, are about to turn Iran into their personal chessboard. This is the great game, and Iran didn't get to choose whether to play. Borders will be lost permanently. A revolution will be sparked in a tea house. And for the first time, the word constitution will be spoken in Persian. This has been 100 years of Iran. See you in the next century.